Hello, everyone. This is Miles Collins with Berkeley Lab. This is the third in our series of trainings for the U.S. Department of Energy's Clean Energy Innovator Fellows. Our topic today is integrated resource planning, and happy Halloween to everybody. Today's training is broken up into 5 sections. We'll have an introduction to integrated resource planning, followed by a section on input assumptions, which will take us to the break. After the 10-minute break, we'll resume with the section on modeling tools, then scenarios and results. And finally, action plan and integration with other proceedings. There will be a Q&A period after each section. You can enter your questions in the chat box at any time. If we aren't able to answer in the chat, then we can address these questions during the Q&A segment. I'll post a link to the slides after I'm done with the introduction here. I'd also like to plug a forthcoming report by Berkeley Lab and Synapse Energy Economics, and you'll be able to see the link to where that report will be posted in the slides. I'll take a minute and introduce today's trainers. JP Carvallo is a research scientist in Berkeley Lab's Energy Markets and Policy Department. His research focuses on long-term power system planning, integration and planning of distributed energy resources, and electric vehicles, and reliability and resilience valuation. Devi Glick is a senior principal at Synapse Energy Economics. She conducts economic analysis and writes testimony and publications focused on a variety of issues related to electric utilities, including power plant economics, resource planning practices, and DER evaluation. She develops in-house electricity system models and performs analyses using industry-standard electricity system models. Shelley Kwok is a senior associate at Synapse Energy Economics. She consults on electricity, buildings, and transportation topics, including resource planning, power plant economics, building decarbonization, energy efficiency, and performance-based utility regulation. She is a co-developer of Synapse's building decarbonization calculator to quantify the impact of changes in heating system turnover on heating system stock and energy consumption. And she has expertise using capacity expansion models to evaluate IRPs and develop optimized decarbonization pathways. We have 2 upcoming trainings for Clean Energy Innovator Fellows. There's one on November 14th on integrated distribution system planning. The second is on December 19th on transportation electrification. The registration links are in the slide deck, and I'll also add them to the chat in just a few minutes. So I encourage folks to sign up for those. We also have a new series of in-person trainings. These are great opportunities to learn and network. While it's ideal to attend the training in your utility commission's region, you can attend any one of the trainings. They have identical curriculum. There's a training in Charlotte on December 11th and 12th, in Detroit on March 11th and 12th, and in Salt Lake City on April 23rd and 24th. The link for that registration will be forthcoming. We have other training and technical assistance resources, and these are available through the links in the slide deck, and which will be posted. And now I'm going to switch and introduce JP Carvallo, who will be doing his who will be doing the first segment of the training. Sorry, I'm going to send this to. I'm going to hand this over to Devi Glick, who will be doing the first part of the training, this introduction to integrated resource planning. Devi,
great, thanks, Miles.
Right ahead. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So as Miles said, my name is Devi Glick. I'm a senior principal at Synapse Energy Economics. Just for a little context, Synapse Energy Economics, we're a pretty small social interest consulting firm, and we do a lot of work in the electric utility regulated space. I personally have done a lot of work with IRPs and integrated resource planning, which is why I'm up here presenting to you today. I've worked in about 20 different states and IRPs in about 13 different ones. So I've got quite a bit of experience across different states that hopefully will be helpful to everyone here today. Do you mind advancing the slide? One more. Great, thank you. And just to caveat that the IRP report is in its final stages, so it's not quite public yet. It will not be published. The link won't be active quite yet, but it will be very soon. So let's start out with what is the IRP? What does IRP stand for? It's an integrated resource plan. So that term, it can be used to describe both the process used to develop the integrated resource plan, the plan that results, so the actual, the action plan, and the report, the integrated resource plan document and report. So it kind of can encompass a variety of different concepts all around the resource planning process. An IRP is a plan that seeks to find the optimal combination of resources from among supply and demand side options to satisfy a future energy mix in the most economic and reliable manner. So there's a lot in that definition, right? You're talking about supply and demand side resources. You're talking about your future energy demand, talking about the economics of the resource mix, the reliability. These are all things that we will get into and explain throughout this presentation. An IRP is primarily used in vertically integrated states where utilities are responsible for both the energy generation and the energy distribution. You'll see on our IRP map, the next slide, that there are IRPs in some states that are not vertically integrated. Those tend to be more focused around transmission, distribution, more integrated planning, but those don't necessarily address generation. IRPs, they provide an opportunity to engage stakeholders, to engage regulators in long-term planning decisions. A good IRP, it should be transparent, it should be clear. The utility's near-term action plan should be clear from the IRP. So on the side here, I've highlighted kind of the concepts that an IRP focuses on and tries to optimize around. So there are reliability requirements. That it means that you have to make sure that your resource plan keeps the lights on at all times. There are regulatory requirements. You have to make sure your IRP complies with federal laws, with state laws, with local regulations. Operational constraints. Your IRP has to respect the fact that physics, power plants operate in specific ways. The sun is only shining during the day. The wind is only blowing at certain times. All of those operational factors have to be respected by the resource planning process. And then, market factors, what's going on in the real world, in, energy markets, in the macroeconomic market. So is there a COVID pandemic and supply chain issues? All of those factors go into the IRP and are reflected in various ways throughout the IRP. Next slide, please. So where are IRPs used? I know it's kind of hard to see the individual colors and states. So the dark blue represents states that currently have an IRP filing. So as you can see, that's, more than half of the country. You've got one outlier here in orange, which is Iowa's kind of working on deciding if they want any sort of IRP process. They don't currently have one, but it's in discussions. The states in this teal green color have a long-term plan requirement, but it's not quite an IRP. So there's requirements for some sort of modeling, but not a full integrated resource plan. And then you've got a bunch of states in gray that do not have any sort of long-term planning filing requirement. The states that are in the Northeast, it's a little bit less concerning because those states are part of organized markets that do a lot of their own planning. But some of the states, Alabama, Kansas, it's a little more concerning that there isn't a centralized process. In Kansas, though, it is a bit of an exception because even though there is not a formal mandate for the entire state, the largest utilities there have been individually mandated to do resource planning. So it's kind of almost the same as having a state mandate. So there's these kind of 4 categories cover the spectrum from all the way from a full IRP, which is the most rigorous type of planning, to just maybe a long-term resource plan. So for example, Florida has what's called a 10-year site plan, does not require any evaluation of, what resources are most economic to build going forward, but they do have to evaluate how to operate their existing resources. there's also states, as I just said, that have no filing requirements. Another thing that distinguishes the different states is the level of scrutiny that the IRPs have to go through once they are completed. So in some states, you have litigated dockets where the IRPs are legally contested. Stakeholders are allowed to intervene, to submit discovery questions. The company has to provide, data and documentation on what they were doing, and it's an entire kind of drawn out process. In some states, the commission has to simply formally acknowledge that this IRP was filed and it complies with the minimum requirements of the law. And that's all. There's nothing more than that. And then there are some places where there are technically no formal approval processes or requirements. So the IRP is simply developed, published, and the utility can choose to follow it or choose to ignore it, and the commission doesn't necessarily approve it fully or not. Next slide. So elements of an IRP. So if you remember on the first slide, when I was reading out the definition of an IRP, there were quite a few components that were there. So one of the components was satisfying future energy service demand requirements. So that just means that meeting the load of the utility, of the system. So one element of the IRP is the load forecast. How much energy is the utility service area going to require? How much capacity? How much, what do they need during that hottest hour of the year, during that coldest hour of the winter? There's demand side resources, so energy efficiency, demand response. What resources does the utility have available to it to reduce the amount of overall generation that they need? Supply side resources. So what generation resources does the utility currently have on its system? What new resources does it have available to add to the system? There are commodity prices. So this is one of the largest inputs to one of the most important drivers of resource planning results, especially historically when our electricity system relies on coal and natural gas, for example. How much does natural gas cost today? How much is it projected to cost going forward? Same with coal. Another commodity price is market prices. How much does it cost to buy and sell electricity into your local market, into the larger wholesale market? How much does it cost to buy from the market next door? There are assumptions around how your utility integrates with the larger market. So this relates to the next topic of topology. So when you're doing an IRP, when you're doing your IRP modeling, utility has to make a decision about how much they are modeling their footprint as part of the larger system they are operating within. So are they pretending that they're an island and focusing on producing all of their own self-supply? Or are they looking at themselves as part of the larger market that they are operating in and actually relying on part of the larger market to supply some of their energy and even capacity? Transmission. So how are they how is a utility connected to other entities? How much power and energy can it physically transport back and forth between itself and other and others outside of its system, so the central market? There are regulatory factors. So what are the federal regulations that the utility has to abide? Are there carbon emission regulations? Are there limits on how much nitrogen oxide they can emit, how much sulfur? Their effluent their waste from their coal plants. Coal combustion residuals. There's a number of regulatory factors that have to be integrated into the IRP, and a number of other system constraints that we'll discuss throughout. Do you mind going to the next slide? So the next kind of basic structure is tools and analysis. So for an IRP, there are a variety of different modeling tools that are used, and JP is going to cover these in depth in the second half of our session. But broadly, the main modeling tools that are used are production cost modeling, capacity expansion modeling, and resource adequacy modeling. So, broadly, capacity expansion modeling, that looks at how do you build and expand your system? So what resources do you have? What resources do you need in the future to supply electricity? A production cost model looks at what resources you have and says, how do you operate your resources? What is the least cost way of operating your resources to provide the energy that your system needs? Resource adequacy modeling looks at how do you ensure that your resource portfolio, your current and your future resources, can meet your demand on assuming maybe extreme weather or extreme really hot temperatures or sustained hot temperatures. So it generally, resource adequacy modeling, instead of just doing maybe a single simulation, it will rely on historical weather data generally, and you run hundreds of simulations to evaluate how does a portfolio perform if under 100 years of historical weather data. So unlike the production cost and capacity expansion modeling, the resource adequacy modeling, generally it's very time intensive, and you generally do it for only a year or two. And JP will talk about this quite a bit more, but it's a kind of necessary component, especially as more renewables are integrated into the system, and we're no longer just relying on kind of large centralized fossil resources the way that historically our electricity system was built. For analysis structure, there are scenarios, there are sensitivities, there are portfolios. The utility generally selects a preferred portfolio to guide its action plan. Shelley is going to be talking a bit more about scenarios and sensitivities and portfolios a bit later on, but because these are terms that are going to come up throughout, I'm just going to quickly define how we're using the terms scenarios, sensitivities, and portfolios throughout. So a scenario is generally a collection of assumptions and constraints, both internal and external to the utility. So you could have a scenario where you assume, high economic growth going forward, or you assume that the greenhouse gas rules under 111 are implemented, or that they are not implemented, or you assume that advanced technologies become increasingly available and are relied upon. So it's a set of kind of a collection of assumptions. A sensitivity refers to basically when you change one part of a scenario. So you only change one thing. You're trying to isolate the impact of a single thing. And a portfolio is a collection of resources that result from your modeling. So when you say the terms tend to get conflated, especially in IRPs and used interchangeably, but I think it's much clearer, and how we use them is that a portfolio is a collection of resources that results, and the scenario is the design that you use to produce the portfolio. Great, and next slide. Great, and then the outputs are, I think I had this twice, your preferred portfolio, your short-term action plan, and then basically really important metrics and results on how much each portfolio cost, what are the emissions of each, and those outputs tend to be the foundation of what the utility uses to evaluate which portfolios to move forward with. Looking at the costs of each, looking at the emissions of each, looking at how much each portfolio relies on market purchases, how much each portfolio relies on natural gas and fossil resources. Okay, that is the brief intro to the IRP. Next slide, great. Next, I'm going to talk briefly about one of the main components of one of the kind of constraining components of IRP, which is the regulatory context. So we can go to the next slide. So on the first slide, when I was defining IRP, one of the kind of constraints I mentioned was regulatory factors. So if you think about it at its core, an IRP really should comply with the law. It should represent a portfolio that is legal. That might sound silly to say that, but it's fascinating how frequently the utilities model core scenarios that don't fundamentally comply with all known federal laws, state laws. It's very reasonable for utilities to test sensitivities or scenarios that ask, what would especially if a regulation is being challenged, such as the current 111 rule. But it's really, the utilities really need, generally need to be modeling core reference scenarios or base scenarios that evaluate what does the future look like based on the current law of the land. So in the IRP, it's about selecting the least cost, least risk plan subject to regulatory constraints. So environmental regulations can be incorporated into IRPs in a number of ways. So generally, regulations, they will rule out certain portfolios that don't meet statutory requirements. So for example, if no one's building any new coal anymore, but if, say, for example, a utility had in its plan to build a new coal plant in 2035, well, if you're modeling 111 rules, the greenhouse gas regulations under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, that's not legal anymore. So that is ruled out. Environmental regulations, they can apply additional capital costs or operation and maintenance compliance costs to certain portfolios. So for example, if a utility has to upgrade its emissions controls to apply with, the Mercury Air Toxins Act, or to deal with effluent limitation guidelines, those are additional capital costs that can get programmed into the model so the utility can decide, is it least cost to comply with this regulation and spend this money, or is it lower cost to retire this resource and not spend this money? Regulations can be incorporated through constraints or caps on emissions. So that can be a cap on an individual power plant, for example, that, power plants can't emit more than certain levels of emissions. It can be a constraint on the entire fleet if it's maybe a more regional or utility-wide constraint. Finally, with carbon prices, you can include a carbon price in your production cost and capacity expansion model as literally an incremental cost per megawatt hour of operating the resource. So you're just adding it in as another cost. So I listed on the side here some of the kind of current relevant regulations that are being actively evaluated and are important in IRPs today. So that's the greenhouse gas rules under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. Federal regional haze rules, those limit nitrogen oxide emissions. Federal effluent limitation guidelines, so that's the ELG acronym for short. Coal combustion residuals. So ELG, that is the wastewater for coal waste. The coal combustion is the actual solid waste itself. The good neighbor rules. Renewable portfolio standards, so that would be modeled through a kind of a utility-wide constraint. Energy efficiency requirements, and any other future federal greenhouse gas rules. Great, next slide. So this map, just a caveat that this is not super up to date, so this is more illustrative. This is an example of the types of, energy mandates and goals that you would look at if you were modeling, for example, an entire US. So understanding, for example, which utilities have 100% decarbonization goals. So those utilities are going to, if they're responsibly doing their IRPs modeling, they're going to integrate those decarbonization goals into their IRP and into their modeling. They'll limit their fleet. For states, those states that are in teal where there are clean energy mandates, those will be, integrated into the IRP and limiting the entire fleet. These state level goals need to get kind of condensed down and integrated into the resource plan through basically by being a limit or a cap on how much carbon emissions there can be, or how much, for example, of what percentage of a utility's energy needs to come from renewables, for example. So there are a variety of ways to do that through IRP modeling. Go to the next slide. Great. And then this is a little bit hard to read. I apologize. And this also is something that Synapse created for the proposed rule, Section 111 under the Clean Air Act. So this does not reflect the final rule. But this is a really good example of how do you convert a federal regulation into a modeling constraint. So, section 111 the rule doesn't explicitly say, this is how you would model emission limits on a coal plant or on a gas plant. It sets, specific technology standards, and it sets, emissions limits, and then we translate those into, well, how does that work in the model? So for example, for coal plants, how is that converted into a modeling constraint for an IRP? Well, it means that any coal unit retiring before 2032 is not impacted. Any coal unit retiring before 2035, it has to, I believe the current rule is to co-fire. Any coal unit retiring before 2039 has to install carbon capture and sequestration. So all of those things in the model, the way that gets modeled is you then take any coal plant that is retiring by 2039, for example, and you program in that coal plant converting to a carbon capture and storage coal plant. You add in those costs. Any coal plant that has to co-fire before 2035, you program in the cost of that conversion, and you then have to program in the cost of their natural gas supply. Those are all the federal regulations then have to get converted to kind of individual actions into, as I said in the previous slide, costs, emissions constraints, fleet constraints. And this is an example of how we did this with the 111 rule. Great, next slide. Okay, so that's carbon, that's the regulatory structure. Next, I'm going to jump around a little bit and go into a little bit of an intro on stakeholder engagement. And after this, we'll stop for questions, but next slide, please. So stakeholder engagement is a really, really important part of resource planning, and a part that sometimes gets overlooked. It doesn't involve kind of the I would say fun modeling, and it's easy to overlook. It involves a different set of skills than kind of technical work to understand how to design a process to fully incorporate stakeholders and take their feedback and engage in incorporate their feedback. So typically IRPs, obviously the utilities are involved. They are the ones that are making the resource plan. Sometimes regional transmission organizations, so the market that the utility sits within will be involved. So that could be if you're in the middle of the country, that's MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. If you're in the Mid-Atlantic, that's PJM. You're in the Central South, that might be Southwest Power Pool. Those may all be involved. Public utility commissioners, they're involved. They're public utility commissioners staff. State environmental regulators sometimes are involved. Sometimes legislators or energy offices. And then your big category of stakeholders and interveners. So stakeholders, interveners are people that represent basically ratepayers, represent parties that are impacted and served by a utility. So I can't just decide that I'm super interested in Mississippi's IRP. I live in Maine, right? It has to be somebody that's actually impacted. So you'll have utility consumer advocates, or sometimes in some states they're called citizen utility boards, state attorney generals, city and municipal governments that are served by the utilities, large industrial and data center customers, environmental advocacy groups, environmental justice groups, resource developers, so especially like solar and wind developers are becoming involved, and other trade groups. These are all parties that are regularly involved. Next slide. So in the IRP best practices report, we go through a bunch of recommendations on how do you design and engage stakeholders effectively. And the key really is in process design. So designing a process that engages stakeholders, allows stakeholders to access materials, to review materials, to provide feedback, and then require the utility to respond to the feedback, to ensure that the utilities are actually reviewing the feedback and the comments. Removing barriers to participation. So a big thing there is allowing, post-COVID especially, allowing stakeholders to participate remotely. Holding stakeholder meetings in multiple parts of the state, so it's not, only a single place. Having public sessions, at night, after work, so that it's not just, paid consultants that are able to participate during a meeting that's happening at 10 a.m. Processes prioritize transparency. So there are obviously some elements of resource plans that utilities don't want to share or won't be able to share. They might be purchasing proprietary forecasts or other things. But overall, majority of the information a utility is using and modeling it should be provided, and it should be transparent to the public. And the utility should prioritize figuring out what it can share instead of defaulting to assuming things are confidential. Engaging technical stakeholders. So recognizing that there is value from engaging experts and other interveners that have experience with resource planning elsewhere and can bring ideas and bring questions on why the utility is doing something a certain way. Provide modeling licenses and data. So this is something that is I've seen and I've been actively involved in several parts of the country. So in Arizona, for example, in North Carolina, in Iowa, utilities actually are required to, and in some states it's part of state energy rules, and in other places it might be the result of a settlement agreement from a separate case. In Iowa's case, it's a rate case. But the utilities are required to basically pay the modeler that they, for the utility software that they use for their IRP, pay for additional licenses for the stakeholders, so that stakeholders that hire technical experts can do their own modeling. So instead of just trusting the utility to and use their black box model, actually allowing other entities to see, oh, these are how the assumptions are being made. This is how the model is working. Allow the stakeholders to run their own models and run their own scenarios. It's a key way to engage stakeholders. Okay, I think that's it for this section. One more slide. Yep, great. And I think that this is where I'm supposed to pause for questions, or are we going to the next?
Sorry, Devi. Yep. So we have a few minutes for questions here. I don't see any questions in the chat. What you can do, if anyone would like to raise their hand and ask a question, Devi, we have about 5 minutes available for questions. Okay.
No, I don't buy it. I'm not scary. I know it's Halloween, but
I love the earrings. Those are fantastic.
I had to do a little something for Halloween. It's not as good as JP's mask you had on before.
Okay. Well, we can save the question time then for later, and then let me reshare my screen. Then I can I think.
Well, I should have talked slower then.
All right, 1 minute. Okay, there we go.
All right, you folks can hear me?
Yes, you're coming through. Thanks, JP.
Great. That's half the work then. Awesome. Thanks, Miles. Thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to start the portion of this training that's devoted to the inputs to the IRP. And this section involves 4 subsections. One is this first one that I'm going to present related to load forecasting and DR forecasting. And then I'm going to cover demand-side resource modeling. And then Devi is going to come in and fill in the other half of the input data components, which include supply-side resource and commodity prices. And then we're going to be able to take a break. So next slide. Just before I start, just wanted to remind folks that you're more than welcome to drop anything in the chat in terms of comments, even questions, comments. things that you have experience related to what we're talking. I think everything serves to create to add to what we're discussing and sort of try to understand how we can better assist in whatever doubts or questions you may have. So let's delve into load forecasting. As you may know, load forecasting is kind of one of the central components of any planning process. If you remove load and you just leave forecasting, this applies to anything from retail, at your local grocery store, all the way up to forecasting oil prices. So anyone that's developing any planning process requires some sort of version of the future, some prediction, especially about the future, as Yogi Berra would say. In the case of IRP load forecasting, of course, over the last 4 or 5 decades of IRP, the practices have coalesced around certain specific types of forecasting approaches. I'm going to very briefly explain some of these. We could spend an entire training on load forecasting methods and approaches, but I'm going to briefly present some of the key components here that can help you potentially navigate and understand what you're seeing in an IRP. First of all is a general approach to load forecasting. There's two broad ones, top-down and bottom-up. A top-down approach is an approach where you take very coarse general aggregate results like population growth or economic activity, and you try to connect that with load growth through some sort of either econometric method or time series method. The econometric methods typically try to predict load as in an equation that has a function of a number of variables that we believe affect load. For example, how wealthy people might be, the types of income they may have, that may translate into higher load forecasting. Some weather variables may also translate to impacts on load forecasting. Time series approaches are more statistical. They try to explain what's going to happen in the future based on what happened in the recent past. On the other hand, we have bottom-up approaches, which are much more model-oriented, engineering-oriented, I would say. And one of the typical methods that you see, and this has become relatively common across IRPs, is what we call the statistical adjusted end use or SAE model. The statistical adjustment comes mostly from a number of corrections that you have to make on the data that feeds this model. But basically, a bottom-up model tries to reflect specific types of loads that show up in residential and commercial customer premises, and tries to understand what is the saturation of these end uses, so how much of that exists and will exist over the planning horizon, and then what is the energy intensity of these uses. So in some other ways, trying to understand if you're predicting certain amount, for example, of heat pump ownership, and I'm going to predict that this heat pump ownership is going to grow in this way, I'm also want to understand what is the expected energy that an average heat pump will consume over a year, for example, and that way I can calculate by multiplying them large aggregates that tell me how much that particular end use is going to be consuming. And then if I clump all the aggregates together, all the different end uses, I can produce a relatively good load forecast based. Again, you can see how the bottom up comes from grouping and creating these aggregates. The hybrid models typically combine both of these. They bring some of the top down for some types of coarse variables, and then they use bottom up for some specific variables, for example, to predict heat pump, right? So, or EV, electric vehicle adoption. The traditional variables that are predicted in IRP load forecasts are two: energy consumption and peak demand. Energy consumption is obvious. We need a certain amount of energy that's going to be met. And this can be expressed. Typically, forecasts these days are very granular, so they cover 8760. So in the past, we used to have winter and summer energy needs or seasonal energy needs to kind of translate to the specific type of resources that could serve those energy needs. But these days, we have granular forecasts that try to go, and I'll get into this in a little bit later. But energy consumption remains one of the key variables that we want to predict. How many megawatt hours or gigawatt hours of energy or electric energy. In addition, up until recently, peak demand had been something that also had been necessarily predicted because a large portion of the IRP effort is related to, as David was explaining earlier, understand from a capacity perspective how much power, how much installed capacity I need to meet the demand at all hours in a reliable way. And so that implies knowing or having a sense on how that energy is shaped over the years, such that I can know roughly when and how big the peak demand is and I can, make sure that I have enough capacity either locally or through imports or contracts to meet it. One of the practice that we are suggesting is that these peak demand forecasts will be slowly being superseded by a much more rigorous treatment of the system needs coming from resource adequacy assessments. And this is something that Devi also mentioned. And I'll delve into more detail later on how these resource adequacy assessments can be used to actually replace a peak demand forecast and do a much more robust resource adequacy assessment or a resource adequacy based prediction or forecast for capacity needs. Finally, you'll see in mode load forecasting that the results are typically split by customer segment. It's very, very common to see residential, commercial, and industrial load forecasts, where the industrial one typically is not made following some of these approaches that I mentioned up there. In general, our utilities that have customers that are very large industrial customers go directly to them to request what their plans are. In some cases, these industrial customers may be planning decommissioning of certain assets or reductions in their workforce such that their load will decrease. So these are very particular idiosyncratic cases. And so over time, the utilities have trended to select the larger customers that they have in their service territory and just ask them directly what is going to happen. What is your best bet of what your load is going to look like? Whether and how these customers are held accountable for that depends a whole lot on how the contracting needs are. But typically, everyone is, of course, has an intention to cooperate to produce the best or more accurate load forecast possible. One of the ideas of having residential and commercial load forecasting individually is that then you can somehow match these to the rate making forecasts that also are split by customer segment, because that's how you start the process of cost allocation and cost recovery. Next slide. Unfortunately, Yogi Berra was right. It is really tough to make predictions, especially about the future. A few years ago, we produced at LBNL a retrospective analysis of 12 of load forecast, energy load forecast for 12 Western load-serving entities or utilities. And what you see here, really roughly, the black line represents the base or the actual outcome of energy consumption for each utility, and the lines that you see in colors are their forecasts as time was passing. And you can see that there's a general trend to consistently over forecast. And granted, this was a period of time where we had a big financial crisis kicking in 2008. But the important thing here is that these results reflect some of the shortcomings of load forecast methods that are now informing where we should take load forecasting in the near future. I'm going to be addressing that in the next couple of slides. But for the most part, the load forecasts in these utilities that rely too much about the future and past or the history in terms of consumption were the ones that were tended to over forecast more easily because they were not internalizing these very recent events that had led to essentially stalling load growth and then maintaining that stall load growth for several years. Of course, one problem that happens when you're analyzing load forecasts is that there is an asymmetric impact on getting the errors. If you over forecast, what may happen is that you could have a few extra units installed and potentially a slightly more adequate system that you would need. It's more reliable than we're societally agreeing to pay. So that may translate into a few cents more in your bill, perhaps, or in your rate, and perhaps a few dollars more in your bill. If you're forecasting the other direction, you may have blackouts. So it's a much harder, it's a very asymmetric error. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be constantly allowing over forecast, but we have to be, mindful that there is a trend to over forecast. And then perhaps one solution to that would be, what are ways in which we can deal with this asymmetry by building some contingency practices that can serve us to avoid blackouts, but not overbuild the system. Next slide. So in terms of some best practices, and this is coming both from the report that we're writing, but this is what we're observing over the last, half a decade to a decade, is that forecasts are beginning to be much more granular and with higher resolution. So we're finding that, as I mentioned earlier, many RFPs are already putting out forecasts that are 8760 that essentially cover every hour of the year. And they're doing that because it allows to feed the forecast in a number of other processes, as I'll show later. And then from a spatial perspective, forecasts originally, maybe not so long ago, used to be a single value for the entire service territory. Perhaps a utility that had two very marked large service territories that were sort of decoupled will have two load forecasts. But as time goes by, the models that we're using to simulate are very granular and detailed as well, and they can capture the topology of the system much better. So the load forecasts are starting to be produced at a more zonal level or even nodal level, as computational capabilities allow. But this means that we have load forecasts that are much more specific to sections of our service territory and that reflect specific aspects of those zones. And this is essentially what brings up the what is brought up and allowed by this end-use focus. While you can do zonal forecasts with top-down approaches, it becomes much harder, and that's where the end-use focus that we're seeing here is becoming also a best practice, in part because it allows you to simulate better new types of end uses that don't have any history in IRP. For example, electric vehicles have only a few years of history, and it's very nascent, so it's hard to say that the behavior and adoption rates of those initial trenches of electric vehicles are going to be very descriptive of what happens in the future. Similar with heat pumps or other emerging end uses that are turning from different fuels to electricity. It's much better, or it's a better shot to simulate these with end uses and several scenarios, as we'll describe later. It's also important, and we're seeing also that end uses are starting to clearly delineate, or a best practice is to clearly delineate a forecast for adoption, a forecast for operation, and then a forecast for your assumptions and how that operation can be shaped and be made flexible. These three different bits are important, mostly because adoption has a whole host of policy, regulatory, and social elements that explain it. Operation is important because it's the way we build the rates and we apply rates to customers, and other incentives will shape the operation. And the same with flexibility. Many of these resources that are large, like heat pumps and electric vehicles, can operate with a flexibility that we can extract and use for system-wide benefits, depending on a number of assumptions. And we want to make those very clear in our forecasts as well. What you're seeing here on the right is one of the challenges that are starting to occur, where the two lines in blue and black were consecutive load forecasts from 2022 IRP for Georgia Power, and then in 2023 we get the green line, which is, you can see there's something like a 25% increase on a year-to-year basis, and there's a whole lot of questions that you as regulators may want to ask and why this happened. But it may serve to know these types of load forecast techniques and what goes into building this forecast to understand why they are coming up with these results. Next slide. As I mentioned, load flexibility is one key element that's starting to emerge. I wanted to immediately point out that traditionally, IRPs since their inception in the 1980s have captured and internalized what we call demand response. Demand response is a specific type of flexibility where we provide incentives to loads, specific types of loads, mostly in the past it being, for example, electric water heating or smart thermostats, and we try to make them operate in such a way that benefit the system in some way. Traditional demand response and energy efficiency have been treated in a separate sort of side document called demand side management studies and conservation studies that then feed into IRP, and we'll explain these a little bit later. But now we have new types of loads that are, as I mentioned, have a potential for flexibility, like electric vehicles and heat pumps. Those are, as far as we can see, are being treated within the load forecast space. There is a chance that over time they might migrate to be treated with the rest of the current demand response programs, but the main difference is that demand response is really a portfolio of offering some products that utilities have already developed for their customers and are really well identified. Whereas EV flexibility and heat pumps are emerging as potential products. It's not quite clear whether they're gonna, or what shape they're gonna take, but there's a chance that they might migrate and be treated within other demand response offerings. A couple obvious flexibility uses that we are expecting to see in these new loads is optimized electric vehicle charging. So we want to understand in the load forecast, what are the assumptions about how the EVs are charging, because those assumptions can have substantial impacts on the peak demand contributions of EVs. And so having to, asking the forecast how many EVs are you modeling? What is the charging assumptions that you're making for these EVs, both in the public setting and the residential setting? All those questions are important to understand what are how appropriate the EV modeling is. Similarly with heat pumps, as they become more adopted and more common, heat pumps can be used for cooling and heating, and they can do, again, pre-cooling and preheating to potentially remove portions of their consumption on certain critical peak hours. And so it's important to understand what are the assumptions that are being made in terms of the management of these systems. Finally, flexibility is something that will be collected and have to be reflected in resource adequacy assessments, and I will talk about that later, but it's important to model them very clearly and transparently in this load forecasting section so they can be used later on in flexibility as part of a resource in resource adequacy assessments. Next slide. When forecasting large loads, it's just been all over the news lately. You may have seen that data centers in particular have made the news, but also other industrial manufacturing loads are starting to take off, and they can significantly impact forecast outcomes, especially not only because these are relatively new, but also because they are very quickly to deploy, and they are happening all across the country, or at least in several sectors of the country at around the same time. So as I was mentioning earlier, the traditional practice in IRP is to treat larger industrial loads sort of individually. And this is not too different from what we're suggesting here. Some strategies, for example, to forecast large loads is to try to create partnerships between the load or the entities behind these loads and the utility to create win-win situations where, for example, the utility can incorporate specific construction milestones in the load forecast. And then when reflecting a load forecast, it can be producing clear go, no-go decisions depending on what the constructions say. And this is, of course, turns into a much more scenario-based analysis, but this is exactly what IRP is driven to do, as Shelley will explain later. There's another strategy to incorporate large loads and mitigate their impact. So one key problem of larger loads is that if you take their declarations and requests for connection at face value, you will build a bunch of capacity to meet these larger loads that may not necessarily be used, because these large loads, without any constraint, they may decide to relocate or to not deploy depending on market conditions. So that key tension can be solved from a forecasting perspective by hedging the risk of the customers of the potential impacts of these large loads by developing, again, partnership types contracts where the large load assumes some of the risk that entails the types of capacities that are needed to meet its needs. And so this risk-sharing contracts allows for the forecast to be smoother and more realistic, because it reflects what could actually happen. And if things go wrong, there is already built in a mechanism to protect customers, at least from portions of the decisions that derive from meeting these larger loads if they were not to materialize. Some specific integration strategies when the loads are starting to shape up. One of them is to try to derive flexibility from these loads from a temporal perspective, try to establish contracts that already bring in flexibility elements of these loads, and try to, for example, require certain peak demand maximums or certain efficiency parameters to ensure that the loads are behaving as efficient as possible and flexibly as possible to benefit the system. From a spatial perspective, you can imagine a regulator or a utility trying to produce locational incentives to better use the system. So sometimes the loads, especially in particular, for example, data centers have specific reasons to be located in certain places, but those may not match the places where the grid is more available and has available capacity to host them. So with those incentives, it might be, or even just locational maps may be clear to point out where the large load can be located, having minimum impacts on system build-outs, at least on the onset. As the load, as you save some capacity build-outs on the onset, you allow the load to express itself and grow, and then you have better information to make decisions for actually deploying capital in the system. There could be even an emerging or aspirational practice is to treat some of these larger loads as you treat generation interconnections. So essentially pull them all and try to sequence them to meet a certain system optimum, rather than just treating each one individually. Transmission planning has, at the ISO level, has shown now for many years that the more coordination you can have in the interconnection process is better for the system to produce a portfolio that is not only least cost, but can be constructed and built faster. So the same applies here. And finally, it's important to use the IRP and analyze new loads from a least cost solution perspective. So trying to understand through scenario analysis how incorporating some of these new loads that are relatively large may have specific system costs. And so you can have some sort of direct, rigorous analysis of their impacts on the system and make decisions based on that. Next slide. Finally, I think on DER forecasting, DERs are very similar in some ways to some of the end uses that we're seeing, like EVs and heat pumps. It actually, in some definitions, EVs and heat pumps are considered distributed energy resources, or DERs. But typically, what shows up as DER more than anything right now in most IRPs is rooftop solar and slowly battery, behind-the-meter batteries. So conceptually, we want to use the same approaches, so trying to separately forecast the adoption of DERs and modeling their operations. Again, because both the adoption and the operation of particularly rooftop solar are quite sensitive to many policies and regulatory decisions like net energy metering. So it's important to be very transparent about what are these assumptions that we're using to predict the adoption and to shape the production of these resources. A best practice is that we're seeing slowly come up is the use of a propensity of adoption method. I'm not going to go into detail here, but the propensity of adoption is a method that internalizes many macroeconomic and microeconomic variables at the customer level to understand how likely a customer it is to adopt resources within a certain time frame. And in that way, I have these are machine learning methods, or trained with a lot of data of existing installations to understand who is more likely to deploy certain types of distributed energy resources. On the operations side, there is not really a best practice over, for a couple of decades of behind-the-meter solar, rooftop solar. The operation has been deemed as being, non-dispatchable. But as we have higher penetration of smart inverters, where you can change the amount of reactive versus active power, and you can change in a dynamic basis how much power you're injecting. And as we adopt batteries that can shape the injections from solar, those are emerging challenges to model in IRP. A couple of very quick best practices in terms of transparency is very important to not hide the DR forecast with a load forecast. And this is something that we have been slowly seeing come up as regulators in particular try to understand better what's in the load forecast. You want to remove out what's netted with DER, particularly the DER that injects power, like solar and storage, and just have it independently reflected from the load forecast itself. And if there is a distribution system plan, which exists in roughly 12 to 13 states, you might want to make sure that the distribution system plan assumptions on distributed energy resources are somehow consistent with whatever is going to the IRP in the same way. And what you're seeing here to the right is a couple of examples from General Electric's IRP. This is a scenario-based approach where they have on the top behind-the-meter solar, and the bottom electric vehicle adoption. And you can see how they have different scenarios. In particularly interesting in the solar case, how they do a case where solar ramps up in adoption much faster versus a scenario where it ramps very slowly. And even though they reach different levels, it's also interesting what happens, the shade that has in between, because that, of course, prompts earlier action rather than a wait-and-see strategy that can be better when you have especially uncertain load forecasts. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to have a poll question here, our first poll question. And the question is, what are some approaches that you think can be used to address this high uncertainty that these emerging large loads bring in resource planning? So as you think about a data center, large 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt data center near the service territory where perhaps you are in your jurisdiction, what are approaches that you can use to address the uncertainty? And this could be a load forecasting, how to get better, or maybe more broadly, how do you deal with the uncertainty that this load might bring in? So feel free to take a couple minutes and drop with your sticky note there some ideas, some quick thoughts, and I may pick a couple and bring them up.
And this is Miles. If you want to put a sticky note up, a shortcut for doing that is you just type N, you just press N on your keyboard, and then a note should pop up for you, and you can just type, and we can share with the group here. So I can see a few that are coming in. That's great. All right,
I
don't
also
be
see-
shy. Let's get a few more in here. I can see 5 or 6.
Is it okay, Miles, to prompt some folks based on what they wrote to kind of unmute and elaborate a little bit?
Sure, JP, go ahead.
All right, I'm seeing one that I want to sort of bring up. Whoever wrote the Monte Carlo simulations, if you kind of mute yourself and just briefly share, there's a folks here that may not even know what Monte Carlo simulations are, so you can explain briefly what they are and how were you thinking on applying it in this case?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew. So when I wrote down Monte Carlo simulation, I was thinking of it in terms of when considering the different, I guess, outcomes and their ability to be modeled with probability, kind of providing the opportunity to pretty much explore the full ensemble of opportunities that could be modeled within the different data sets.
Perfect. Yeah, I wanted to thanks, Andrew, for explaining it. So Monte Carlo simulation is indeed a way of dealing with uncertainty by transforming some of the variables that typically have a single value into a probability distribution, and then drawing from a distribution as you were to flip a coin and get heads and tails. Do that with a distribution that can give you a range of values, not only head and tails, and then running your simulations, either a power flow or a capacity expansion model or a load forecast model, such that you get an array of potential outcomes, and you can see how likely are you to have an outcome on the tail, very large value, or how likely you are like to have a low value, or how concentrated your results are around a certain median or average. What's interesting is that for particularly large loads, it can be tricky to use a Monte Carlo approach because they're so idiosyncratic that it's hard to find a proper probability distribution that describes the ranges, for example, of power that a data center may want to obtain. So this is where a scenario-based approach that we're going to explain later might go a longer way on especially communicating clearly to stakeholders what are the possible outcomes of a particular large load that might deploy. But it's still a great comment that feeds into what we're going to talk a little bit later on resource adequacy. Just I'm quickly going to read out some of the ones that I'm seeing here. So someone saying running sensitivities on your baseline scenarios to get a wide sense of possibility. This is exactly very complementary to the Monte Carlo one, but this is kind of the version where you run some specific sensitivities, modifying some aspects of, for example, the timing of this load showing up, the location of the load showing up, the staggered rate of which load is going to grow. So many of these data centers are deployed in sort of trenches. And it's not that they deploy the 100 megawatts at the beginning. They deploy maybe in staggered, so you can test for that, etc. Someone saying here, scale the forecast by the certainty of load connecting. That's very interesting. So if we can attach a certain likelihood of loads and maybe bucket our loads, our large loads, into reasonably certain loads and much more uncertain loads, and then we can treat those differently. That's another very interesting approach. Let's move on back to the slides. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff here that you folks are putting, but unfortunately, I don't have time to cover them all. And I want to hop into demand-side resources modeling and then pass it to Devi. There you go. So next slide. So as I was mentioning, there's 4 key components on inputs. Load forecasts are one. And the supply side, we have supply side inputs and we have commodity prices. But then one key component that goes into IRP as an input is demand side resources. And actually, there's a certain aspect of this that might not be treated as an input, and we're going to cover this. But as I was mentioning, demand side resources have been one of the core elements of IRP since its inception, coming out of least cost planning in the 70s. In the 80s, when IRP was developed, one of the core ideas behind this was to incorporate actively demand-side resources as a resource in IRP to really account for what customers could do in terms of responding by shaping their loads or reducing it based on both energy efficiency and demand response programs. What you're seeing up there in the diagram is the classic way, the traditional way in which the market potential studies are constructed. So you first decide on a number of demand resources and energy efficiency resources that are going to analyze. Then you estimate for each one of those participation rates and load direction potentials. And then you calculate technical and achievable potentials. And sometimes there's a third sort of market potential, but you calculate sort of how much can you realistically go out and acquire in the market. And of course, there's a whole lot of modeling that goes into getting decent values for these assumptions. And when you multiply this by the program cost, you have a certain portfolio of demand-side resources that you can recognize then in IRP. As I mentioned early, energy efficiency and demand response, with very narrow definitions of demand response, have been typically treated as these demand-side resources. And as again, all this analysis happens in a side report that's called the market potential study or the conservation potential study that is a lateral report to IRP because it feeds also on a number of regulatory cases. So it's a report that in itself is not only made for IRP, but it serves other purposes as well. Next slide. When modeling demand-side resources, there's two main ways in which IRPs internalize demand-side resources. The traditional way that has been predominant over the last few decades is a load modifier approach, where you assume you make calculations of what is a certain amount of cost-effective energy efficiency and demand response that you could adopt based on screening tests that make sure that the amounts of energy efficiency and demand response are cost-effective for the customers that are adopting it, the customers that are not adopting it, and then the utility as a whole. And when you pass those tests and you're included in here, and then you constrain some of this potential based on what you can actually acquire based on effort, then you subtract those values from your load forecast. And that produces a sort of a net load forecast. And that's really the load modifier approach. One of the key problems of the load modifier approach is, one, that it doesn't really guarantee that you are adopting all the cost-effective demand-side resources. Typically, utilities are given targets for demand-side resources to procure, and once they meet their targets and they just say, okay, I have to procure, say, 100 megawatt hours of energy efficiency, this is the portfolio that's going to meet that 100 megawatt hours in a cost-effective way, I'm done. But whether there were maybe another 100 megawatt hours of energy efficiency that were still cost-effective to acquire from the whole IRP perspective, we will never know. The other problem with load modifier is that it conflates these demand-side resources with the load forecast. And what's problematic about that is that when you analyze the uncertainty of these two different components of the load forecast, they're quite different. The uncertainty of an energy efficiency program or the uncertainty of an EV adoption are very different. But if they're all mixed in a load forecast, I cannot tell them apart. The competitive resource approach is one where you use the same information of the load modifier, essentially the potential for reduction and the expected participation rates and the program costs, but you build a supply curve that you see here in the chart to the right. This is one from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council 2021 plan, where they build a curve, and you can see here in dollars per kilowatt hour a year, ranging from very cheap to very expensive resources. And you can input this curve as is into a capacity expansion model that is able to traverse the curve and select the least cost optimal amount of resources, not based on a specific mandate, but based on what are the resources that have the least cost output to the system, which is what IRP should do. So this competitive resource approach is a little bit harder to implement. It's a little bit more challenging, but it's well within the computational capabilities of most utilities, and it's slowly becoming a more adopted practice across several utilities. Some of the key best practices, I think I mentioned a few of these already. Let me focus on the second one here, bundling measures. So typically, the measures that go in demand-side resources can be very detailed. So residential air conditioning control program. It's a very specific type of end use, very specific customer segment. Sometimes it's good to bring some of these measures together and group them to pass them into the model, in part to reflect better program implementation, which typically implements some of these measures in bundles, but also to simplify a little bit the computational challenges or computational complexity. Another important thing is that when you're building scenarios into some of these adoptions and expected reduction rates, you want to make those scenarios consistent with IRP when needed. And finally, when possible, in some cases, as mandated by regulation, you want to incorporate all the relevant benefits for demand-side resources that are not only the capacity benefits at the bulk power system level, but could be transmission deferrals, it could be distribution system capacity deferral benefits, and it could be price benefits, etc. You want to try to incorporate those. And there's a whole host of modeling that goes in there, but that's something that you may want to also be on the lookout. This is my last slide on my section, and I think I want to take a quick break here to answer at least one question that's here in the Q&A, and then I'll pass it to Devi for his section on the inputs. So the question here from Alex is, how do you encode policy and regulatory incentives into your forecasting model? That's a good question. I think it starts by listing all the policies and regulatory incentives that are relevant to shaping load and to informing both adoption of end uses and the shape of those end uses. For example, any rebates on new energy efficient refrigerators, any EV incentives like the ones that exist today from the federal government, code in the IRA. So you can list all these different policy incentives, and then you start to identify which ones are affecting adoption, which ones are affecting operation. For example, an investment type of credit will not affect the operation of the end use, but it will affect whether it can be, the cost is lower, and it might incentivize an extra amount of adoption. So through a propensity of adoption model, we'll be able to identify how that cost reduction translates into a certain adoption. And you can then create a link between the specific policy and, in this case, the adoption. As you have policies and regulations for adoption, operation, and flexibility, and you can track exactly which influences which, you're creating a clear connection between the three components of load forecasts and the policy and regulatory incentives, and that flows into a forecasting model direct. Any other questions that I can take before we pass it? I see a hand up, Andrew.
Hi, I'm just curious, this is maybe more about forecasting in general, but I'm curious how you should treat like weather events versus average weather. So for example, where I'm located in Minnesota, there's a lot of concern on, polar vortexes or low wind events for multiple days. And so how should you include those in models or treat them compared to like a typical weather year?
Great question. Very briefly, in 2 words, resource adequacy. So what you're describing is the classic issues that resource adequacy assessments have to deal with, which is having uncertain outcomes for weather, in particular extreme weather events, that will push not only the load in a certain direction, but might also affect the supplies that I have to meet that load on a given moment in time. For example, polar vortices that can froze turbines or can froze fuel lines and produce issues with much higher and correlated outage rates across portions of my fleet. So from the load forecasting perspective that we're seeing, typically you work on the average side. What we're seeing more is that you transform your resource adequacy assessments as a way to understand the actual capacity that you need to deal with these unexpected types of events. Through the resource adequacy assessment, as we'll review later, we can understand what are the expected shortfalls of these types of more extreme events, and whether those shortfalls in terms of magnitude and frequency are within the tolerance that as a society have agreed we're willing to tolerate, or if they're too much, then we need to incorporate more capacity. And then we suggest a best practice of an iteration between your resource adequacy outcomes and your capacity expansion model to go back and forth until you deploy enough capacity in a least cost fashion to bring your shortfall probabilities to a level where we say, okay, this is what we want. But this is, and so to your question about load forecasts, the load forecasts that go into the resource adequacy assessments are very particular and are made to deal with this, as we'll explain later. So with that, I'll pass it to Devi to continue on the supply side resources.
Great, thanks, JP. So JP just went through load forecasting and demand side resources. So now we're going to turn to supply side resources. So supply side resources, that's resources that generate power, generally central station resources, you know, your traditional coal plants, gas plants, you know, steam plants, combustion turbines, combined cycle plants, solar farms, wind farms, batteries. What I'm going to do in this section is kind of run through the best practices essentially of modeling supply side resources and go over some of the basic kind of inputs that are part of modeling supply side resources in an IRP. So first, just the most fundamentally, you know, how do you characterize new and existing resources to input them into an IRP model? Well, you need basic generator information, right? You need to know how big is the generator? How many megawatts is it? How long is it expected to be available for and to operate for before the model needs to pick a new resource? How efficient is the resource? So from a perspective of how efficiently does it convert fuel to power? So what is it generally? It's going to be a heat rate if for a fossil resource. What is for, you know, if you have a solar farm or a wind resource, what is the shape of the output that's expected from that resource? You know, the hourly output. For fossil resources, what are the ramping characteristics? So how quickly can a resource turn on and turn off? How quickly can it ramp up and down so that the model knows how it can be relied upon, how it can use that resource? A resource that's available that, you know, a combustion turbine, for example, that can be turned on and off relatively quickly, it's going to be used by the model very differently as a peaking resource, for example, than, you know, a baseload coal plant that takes hours and maybe costs tens of thousands of dollars to turn on and off. You need to know outage rates and outage schedules. So does the utility have a planned maintenance schedule for a unit, or does a unit have just an outage factor that it, you know, percentage of time it's likely to be unavailable because it is, you know, has a planned or unplanned outage? What are the emissions rates of each generator, of each unit? This is especially important going back to one of the earlier sections when talking about regulations and modeling regulations. You have to know what the emissions are from each resource and what kind of installed controls there are that limit emissions on each resource. There's, you know, resource costs. So what are the fixed costs that you incur on each resource and what are the variable operating costs? How much does it cost to build a new resource? How much does it cost to maintain an existing resource? So everyone, you know, you have a car, you got to pay money regularly to maintain that resource. You know, the transmission breaks, there's costs you have to incorporate into your planning that you have to expect. You know, for renewables, you know, are there integration costs? Are there interconnection costs for those resources for, you know, combustion turbines as well for all resources? Other inputs to think about, you know, capacity factors. How much energy can you expect to get from a resource? And capacity contributions. So what is the capacity contribution of a resource? So I'll go through most of these in more detail in the next few slides. So next slide. Here I just have an example of kind of what resource characterization can look like in an IRP. So in this case, this is new resources. Obviously, it's kind of acronym soup here with, you know, combined cycle plants, combustion turbines, aeroderivatives, carbon capture and storage. You've got gasification plants. So first, heat rate. This is what I was talking about with efficiency. So how efficiently does the plant convert fuel to generation? What are the variable costs that are incurred every time the plant operates, every megawatt hour? What are the fixed costs? So how much does it cost regardless of how much you operate the plant just to keep it online? So you can think about, you know, you have to pay people to operate a plant regardless of whether it's being, you know, run 100% of the time or 10% of the time. You've got to keep the plant, you know, ready to operate. You've got to keep it maintained. Those things don't change with the variable output. Those are fixed costs. Book life and then real dollars. This is an example of kind of how an IRP would characterize new resources. Next slide. Okay, new resource costs. So resource costs are a really critical input to an IRP because, you know, the definition that I provided of IRP up front, one of the key components was a plan to meet demand with supply and demand side resources that, you know, is least cost. This cost part is really critical. It really impacts the selection of a resource portfolio of a preferred plan at the end. So therefore, it's very important for utilities to use accurate resource cost assumptions. You know, a utility knows how much it costs to operate a power plant, you know, currently, how much it cost last year. It might have a projection of, it's not going to necessarily know how much it costs with certainty to build a new resource though. But there, you know, there's a lot of sources of information and it really needs to be using the best available, most current information. So there's a lot of publicly available information on new resource costs. So many of these might be familiar to the group here, but you know, the Energy Information Administration publishes an annual energy outlook that has resource cost data. National Renewable Energy Lab has their annual technology baseline each year. Lazard publishes a levelized cost of energy and levelized cost of storage analysis. These are really good public sources of information that can be used to benchmark, you know, individual utility data. Utilities sometimes rely on proprietary data. So, you know, some common names I see pop up a lot are, you know, Navigant, Wood Mackenzie, Burns McDonald. These are all kind of proprietary sources that are a little bit less transparent. And then utilities can use all sorts of RFPs. So RFP means request for proposal. So that means they're actually going out to the market. That can sometimes be the best source of information. So the goal with resource cost assumptions is to get the costs as close as possible to what the utility is actually likely to see. So the modeling is as close to reality as possible. Using actual cost data can be the best source of that information. So some best practices that we've outlined in this report for selecting resource costs are using the RFP results where possible, but where they're out of line with kind of expectations. So for example, it's possible an RFP wasn't conducted super fairly, or the parameters were too constraining and the results weren't comprehensive or accurate. It's important to conduct supplemental analysis to understand why the results were not in line with expectations. Best practice to use cost trajectories going forward based on technology maturity curves. So, you know, the utility might have a bit more certainty today about what the cost might be and might be uncertain going forward into the future. They should still use technology curves that are based on the best available industry data. So for example, the NREL technology baseline. What I've seen sometimes as what I would consider a poor practice is that utilities are uncertain about how costs will change in the future. They might make very simplifying assumptions, such as assuming that all costs remain flat going forward. That assumption might seem benign. You might say, oh, well, if it's applied to all resources, solar, wind, gas, it should have no impact. The problem is that those type of simplifying assumptions can introduce systematic bias into a system. If you think about, you know, a new gas plant, for example, that's not a technology that's a pretty well-developed market, a pretty well-developed technology. You know, solar and wind, those technologies there's a market for it, but there's still refinements happening. There's still, you know, backlogs in the interconnection queue, for example, things that are well accepted that are likely to be relieved, where the cost trajectories are expected to fall on some of these technologies in ways that they're not expected to fall on conventional resources. So when you use simplifying technologies that all costs are going to stay flat, you're removing the very likely projected, you know, cost declines from renewables that kind of NREL industry sources project you'll see going forward by saying that you assume that all costs are going to stay the same. Another important component with accurately projecting new resource costs is including all tax credits and program incentives. So the Inflation Reduction Act had a lot of tax credits. The Energy Infrastructure and Reinvestment Act had incentives for building new energy resources at the site of retiring coal plants. Those are all factors that should be incorporated into the costs of new resources with IRP modeling. Next slide. Another important consideration is the timing and availability, the timing of resource availability. So here the real challenge is balancing the desire to optimize your modeling, your resource planning modeling, and really get the most optimal solution with reflecting real world actual constraints. So following, the COVID pandemic, for example, caused some pretty significant supply chain constraints that are still being resolved. That meant that it became more challenging for developers, for utilities to get the same parts that they could get before. There have been construction delays, siting and permitting challenges, local opposition. There's interconnection queue backlogs they're being addressed through various measures at Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and at the individual markets, but there's still backlogs. Supply chain constraints, as I mentioned, and labor shortages. These are all real world challenges, but how do you incorporate these into an IRP? So the best practice is to model scenarios with and without these constraints. So the problem with just assuming that, the most conservative is that you're not letting the model optimize. So you're not asking the question, well, what happens if we find a way to address the backlog, or if there is reform that allows the interconnection queue to back up? If you're just saying, oh, right now things look constrained, I'm going to assume we can't bring any new solar on until 2032. Well, you're never going to know what was what the most economic option was, and what to be striving for if you were able to address some of these challenges. So it's best to model scenarios both with and without the constraints to see both the current most, optimized results, and then the results if you basically assume the worst case, which is of current constraints. Another best practice is to model expectations of how the constraints will change over time. You expect that the backlogs, interconnection queue backlog, will let up in 5 years. Make sure you change how much you allow the model to build. So don't put, a 100 megawatt a year build limit on solar for every year. Change that limit over the years. Utilities should be proactive with procurement. If a utility knows it's having trouble procuring sufficient resources, don't wait until it needs it. Go after it earlier so that there is enough lead time. And utilize surplus interconnection rights. So especially where existing resources are retiring, look for ways to leverage those rights. And that's something that clients that I work for are often advocating for during utility IRP proceedings, is not letting those interconnection rights expire, but evaluating how they can be used. Next slide. Okay, these next two slides are on firm capacity. So another critical kind of input for the supply side resources is understanding how much both energy and capacity a resource can provide. So on the energy side, usually you use capacity factors, or as I discussed earlier, the resource output shapes from a solar or wind farm. The capacity factors, those represent how much power, how much electricity a power plant can produce relative to its theoretical maximum. So there are going to be obviously outages, there are going to be maintenance. You might not need the power plant at all times. So how much do you actually expect it to operate? For capacity, for firm capacity, those metrics are, and JP is going to talk a lot more about resource adequacy modeling, but fundamentally you want to understand how much do you tell the model is available from this resource during peak. So there's a lot of different measures a lot of acronyms that are thrown around to characterize firm capacity. And it's a little bit of like it's changing really quickly in terms of like seasonal capacity accreditations and the way that we think about firm capacity with resource adequacy. But right now there's the firm capacity generally is talked about in terms of, there's ICAP, installed capacity. There's UCAP, which is unforced capacity. That's you consider outages. There's planned and forced outages, unforced outages. So you'll see those terms talking about planned, meaning you decided, you knew when maintenance was going to happen, versus unplanned, you didn't know. Though those factors have to be programmed in. There are, not just with power plants, but with fuel supply. So if you think about your natural gas plant, it runs on natural gas. So the power plant might be available 24/7, 365, but if you don't have a guaranteed pipeline and source of natural gas 24/7, 365, then that plant doesn't actually have a firm capacity equivalent to the resources output. You need what's, a firm fuel contract, the term firm meaning that it's just always available. Additionally, there's considerations for transmission congestion. So all of these have to be considered when evaluating how to program in the firm capacity, the availability of a power plant at peak, which obviously will differ based on whether it's, is it a combined cycle plant? Is it a gas plant? Is it a solar farm? Is it a wind farm? In the past, there was a single, megawatt number that was given. If you go to the next slide, what we're seeing and what JP will talk more about with resource adequacy is we're moving towards measures that look more at the ability of the resource to generate electricity when the system is most likely to experience peak. So it's called effective load carrying capability or carrying capacity. This is really a resource adequacy construct. So rather than just in the past looking at the output of a resource in isolation, so saying, oh, this gas plant can generate, 90 megawatts at max output. That's going to be what we program in for its firm max capacity. Instead, it's looking at the output of the resource and also the needs of the system. So what these charts are showing, this top one is an example of showing. So it's probably really hard to read, but you'll see hours of the day on the bottom axis there, and it's showing how over the years the risk, the hour of the day in which you are most likely to have peak and to have reliability risks, that moves back later and later in the day as the penetration of solar on the system increases. So as you get more and more of a resource on the system, that shifts the peak, that shifts the time at which you are concerned. So if you look at the table below, I think this is from one of the Duke IRPs. It's looking at what's called tranches. So like, the first 1,000 megawatts of solar, the second 1,500, the next 1,500 megawatts of solar, and so on. It's saying how much does this resource contribute to peak at each tranche? So you'll see that winter, it's pretty much always the same. It's very, very low. That's likely because if you have a morning, especially if you have a morning peaking time around, 6 a.m., so the sun's not up. It physically can't help you during that time. But the more interesting part is that summer line, and as you see, the first tranche is 40%, and then it goes down to 30% and 20. And that really just reflects that as the penetration of solar on the system increases, the ability of that incremental solar to contribute to peak goes down because there is more and more solar, and the peak is being shifted later. So basically you need firm resources, you need batteries, or, in some cases, utilities like to do CTs. I like to go to batteries though, to provide that firm capacity that can be available during peak. Okay, next slide. And I'm gonna have to go these a little bit quicker than I was, so I apologize. I'm gonna have to start skipping around a little bit here. Next, I'm gonna talk a little bit about renewable energy costs. And this is not just the capital cost, but this is how do you model the cost of, that renewables require, of additional services may be required from renewables. So if you think about when you add solar to the system, sometimes adding it to the transmission system requires additional upgrades to the system. Now that's true of any resource, right? But in the past, there were not a huge number of large new resources being added all over the system. You'd have some added, the utility would build one power plant in a centralized place. Now you've got solar being added and all over, wind being added all over. That's adding costs in a new way. That's really challenging to understand. So what tends to happen is utilities will just add in generic costs. They'll say, oh, we assume that every megawatt, every new solar project is going to add, it'll be $125 a kilowatt. They're just adding costs that aren't necessarily based on actual incremental system costs. So it's really important that all, incremental interconnection and renewable integration costs be based on full, actual studies. So renewable integration costs being, how does the system, basically ancillary services, reliability needs, how do they change when you add more solar or wind or renewables? And interconnection being, what are the incremental transmission costs? So rather than the utilities kind of just assuming conservatively that additional costs, really basing those on real studies so that you don't disadvantage systematically renewable resources. Next slide. Another key input is avoidable forward-going costs. So when you think about fossil resources, we're talking about regulations. One of the things I brought up was with new environmental regulations, a lot of times there'll be additional capital costs required to comply. Those costs should be modeled in the model, right? They should be thrown in. What utilities sometimes do is they will evaluate those in post-processing steps, so outside the model. The problem with that is that it doesn't allow the model to see that cost in making a retirement decision. So a really important practice that I feel like a broken record, I'm almost always advocating for the importance of in these utility IRP proceedings, is modeling and evaluating forward-going avoidable costs as part of your resource planning modeling. And looking at what cost utility is using, benchmarking those against historical spending, industry projections, making sure those costs are properly represented as declining in advance of retirement, but not omitting those costs and just viewing them in post-processing. Because if you do so, you're not allowing the model to actually make optimized retirement decisions. Next slide. Next, briefly, battery storage poses some challenges, or it needs to be modeled differently than, I guess, normal supply side resources, because it can store electricity instead of just generating electricity. And it also can provide a lot of grid services in ways that other resources don't necessarily provide. It's really important to properly model all of the services, all of the values, all the different durations of battery storage to properly capture their value. So 2-hour, 4-hour, 8-hour, long duration, instead of just, what utilities tend to do is just maybe throw in 1 4-hour battery, but really understanding what services the utility needs and what therefore kind of durations or technologies can really offer value to meet the needs that the utility has. Next slide. And then advanced technologies. So this is something that has been coming up with a lot of regularity just within the past couple of years. Even 5 years ago, it was not seeing this nearly as much. The keys with advanced technologies, the big things I look for is ensuring that there's consistent treatment of advanced technologies. So utility isn't picking winners without justification. So, small modular nuclear reactors, SMRs, long duration storage, hydrogen conversion and hydrogen co-firing, carbon capture and storage. Those are kind of the most common ones we see today. What I see a lot of times is a utility might decide to model just SMRs, but not long duration storage without justification. So really what I look for is consistency in which resources are being included and modeled, and modeling of risk. So some of these technologies, for example, especially carbon capture, they're really capital intensive. And when you have new, not necessarily commercially available, capital intensive projects, the error bars, the potential risk, potential cost overruns are huge. And understanding that risk will be on ratepayers is really important in modeling advanced technologies. And then next slide. Okay, final slide here is modeling market interactions and transmission solutions. So this gets back to the topology concept I brought up at the beginning, which is the modeling how the individual utility footprint fits within the larger market, the larger transmission network. So not modeling the utility as an island, but understanding the transmission connections that are available. Oops, sorry. How much transmission is available. And looking at other regional resource planning, especially if a utility operates with an RTO, what other regional resource planning has occurred. Modeling, tranches of transmission as an alternative to generation build out. And aligning the capacity expansion modeling with the regional modeling to ensure that you're modeling the market representation accurately. I think we're at the time for break. I don't know if I should just quickly run through the commodities or what the best option is.
Yes, Devi, why don't you run through the commodities, and then we can take the break, and then I think we'll speed the second half up.
Okay.
You were gonna run through this part before the break anyway, so I think, is
Great.
that right? Yep.
Yes, that was my plan, and I can try to do this commodities pretty quickly. Do you want to go another slide or two?
You bet.
Awesome. Okay. So commodity prices are another key input. Commodity prices, this really refers to the fuel, the market prices, the emission prices. They're really central to the results of an IRP. So especially where you have, natural gas plants, for example, coal plants, the largest driver of the cost of operating those plants is the fuel. Therefore, the fuel price forecast that's used is really significant, has a huge impact on the results from the IRP, on the revenue requirements. Generally, fuel price forecasts are developed by external entities, so they're not developed, necessarily by the utilities. Electricity market prices, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes utilities do their own market modeling, and sometimes utilities will also buy the forecasts. Best practices with commodity price modeling that we talk about in this report. First is to really think about fuel supply limitations. So making sure that I was discussing the firm, gas supply earlier, making sure that those fuel supply limitations are incorporated into the IRP, because those represent real costs. If you have to build a pipeline, if you have to pay more for a firm gas contract, that has a cost. That cost will impact how much it costs to operate a fossil plant. That is really important to capture. Capture the impacts of fuel price volatility so that ratepayers pay for those. Those fuel costs are generally directly passed through. It's not just necessarily enough to just model high gas prices, but understand what happens with volatile gas prices and how to minimize the volatility, maybe by reducing reliance on gas resources as one potential option. And understanding the impact of coal supply constraints in the market. So as the coal industry becomes smaller and contracts, how does that impact coal supply and coal prices? Okay, next slide. So just quickly on coal prices, generally the way fuel pricing forecasting works, this is just very high level. Coal prices, near-term prices are generally tied to existing contracts. Longer-term prices usually are based on fundamental forecasts. So for example, the annual energy outlook. Delivered prices, they can include substantial transportation costs. So that is a large part of a coal cost generally, not just the mine cost, but the transportation costs. And I've come across some really interesting issues with coal plants, being mine mouth coal located, then where the costs are really challenging to track, and that has to be incorporated and recognized in the IRP. Natural gas prices are often tied to future markets. So near-term prices rather are based on actual future contracts. Further out, there aren't as many contracts. So those have to be based generally on more, model-driven fundamental forecasts once again. Forecasts are generally tied to, central hubs. So Henry Hub, delivered prices might represent the difference. But there's a potential for substantial volatility with gas prices. Next slide. So market prices, once again, near-term prices are also often tied to future markets. A key thing with market prices is, especially where the utility is doing its own energy price forecasting, is making sure that the market prices and the gas prices and the market prices that are being used for the modeling the individual utility footprint and the larger market are aligned. So ensuring if you're using high gas prices in one, you're using high gas prices in both. If you're modeling a CO2 price in one, you're modeling a CO2 price in both. So making sure there's alignment. And next slide. Okay, and this is the last one, and this is the more interesting part, is understanding volatility and constraints in fuel supply. So I know these graphs are probably pretty hard to see, but the one on the left is natural gas prices, 2011 to present. So if you look, that giant spike around 2021, 2022, from that, from when the war in Ukraine, that has a huge impact on the cost to operate these power plants, these gas plants during this time, and on market prices. And figuring out how to modeling that, as I said, not just high prices, but the volatility. Looking at the graph on the right, this is historic coal plants, coal prices rather. So once again, that giant spike in the 2021-2022 time period for several of the coal mines had a huge impact on the cost to operate these coal plants during that time period. And understanding that and modeling that, incorporating that into the IRP is really key. Okay, I think that's it. I think I can take questions or go to a break, whichever we prefer.
Thanks so much, Devi. Let's take one. I have one question in the chat and then we'll go right to the break. Question is, it's from Josie Schwass, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I'm just curious on Devi's thoughts on ELCC in regards to incentivizing new generation, particularly in an RTO. I am at a state commission in PJM, so there's a lot of conversation about ELCC.
So I'm not totally clear on what thoughts on ELCC in regard to incentivizing new generation. If you're able to come off mute and clarify what you mean, I'd love to answer that question.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, it's okay if not. It's just something that I've been thinking about, but PJM currently uses ELCC in their capacity market. And PJM's recent capacity auction had some really high prices, which has everybody really looking at how the market is structured. And so one of the biggest questions or concerns has been around ELCC and how certain generation resources are valued differently underneath the ELCC construct. And so there's sometimes that people think it might be influencing who is incentivized to build generation in the region. But no worries if not, it's just a question I've had. So hope that helps.
Yeah, so I think the best practice is to use the ELCC for all resource types. So I can't remember in PJM if it's only used for renewables, but to use it for all resource types. So in some places it's not used for fossil resources, it's only used for renewables. And the key is to ensure that if you're only using it for certain types, so only for renewables, if then you have to take into account like weather correlated outages or other factors that influence fossil resources, like based on historical weather, that are not properly captured by typical capacity accreditation. Because the way that the ELCC works is it does take into account kind of historical weather years, this larger data set. And if you're not going to use that for all resource types, then you have to somehow take into account, incorporate those factors when evaluating firm capacity for conventional resources, so coal plants and gas plants generally. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking.
No, that's extremely helpful. Thank you so much.
Yep.
All right, thanks so much, Devi and JP. We'll take an 8-minute break. We'll come back at 3:58 Eastern time. So everyone go get a coffee, stretch your legs, and we will return with a discussion on modeling tools. And looking forward to that very much. All right, I'll see everyone in 8 minutes. Thank you. Okay, we are back. It is 3:58 Eastern Time. JP, are you here? Excellent. I'm gonna pass it right along to you to get started.
Yeah, let's. I know those with younger humans are gonna be hitting into the Halloween pressures in the East Coast soon, so I'm gonna try to keep it so we can end at 5. Let's talk about models. Next slide. IRP uses models because, of course, we can't run experiments on the power system. It's very costly and complex. So we use models. And in particular, because most of what IRP does, as Devi mentioned earlier, is thinking about future and least cost ways to meet future needs. So we have to think about the future. So there are several modeling tools that go into IRP. You can see them here in the diagram. The two or the three that we're going to focus on today, as Devi also anticipated, is production cost model, capacity expansion model, and resource adequacy assessment model or reliability models. Very briefly, you can see to the left, there are typically now in much more used climate models that translate into weather models that can feed several portions of IRP. Load forecasting in itself is a series of models that are used to produce load forecasts and growing complexity. And the demand response and energy efficiency potential study also has a number of models embedded to predict the levels of demand response and efficiency that are cost effective. So lots of modeling happening, but let's focus on the three models. I'm going to progress here in the next slide and describe one of the first key models, capacity expansion modeling. And this is very basic, but I want to make sure that everyone gets this. So several of you that are familiar with capacity expansion models might not need it. But essentially, capacity expansion model tells you how to meet a future load forecast subject to certain expected price forecasts for fuels and capital costs for different types of technologies. But in some cases, expected costs for expanding transmission and the types of transmission lines and location of the transmission lines. And so what you see here in this very simple diagram is how the model sort of thinks and progresses over time. So in the first period, you have what's called the present day. In this case, several customers with a given grid that is interconnected them, that is fulfilling all criteria for reliability and has a certain level of costs. And as you go on and the loads start growing, then you need to start either expanding some existing locations with new technologies, replacing them, and adding some transmission lines. And as you keep going here to the right, you may even add more transmission lines. You potentially deploy other types of resources, including storage. And the capacity expansion model is making these decisions such that you always make sure that you have the least cost solution that meets all policy, regulatory, and environmental constraints. Next slide. On the production cost model, the very basic aspect, a difference between capacity expansion and production cost is that the key decision variable in a capacity expansion model is the size and the technology choice for certain types of resource. And what is the capacity that I need for that resource? The production cost model is used on a daily basis or on a sort of more short-term basis to decide, once I have a given system that has a certain grid and certain types of resources that are not changing, that are considered fixed, what is the optimal way, the least cost way to operate that system? And this is what RTOs and ISOs do, but utilities that run IRPs that then own their own generation have to do it as well. They have to make sure that they're demonstrating that in a daily basis, they're running their system in the least cost way, but also is how they reflect the way their system operates in their IRPs. Now, it's a best practice these days is that production capacity expansion models also include a layer of production cost models at the same time. So when the model is calculating this expansion, is taking into account both the cost of installing the capacity and retiring it, but as well the costs of operating it. But the truth is that to make that capacity expansion model really converge in reasonable time, the production cost model version that's embedded is relatively simplified. The specific production cost models that are used in iteration with the capacity expansion are doing some other more fancier things, such as including unit commitment, which is a binary variable that defines how in reality these units operate. And is adding a number of more technical constraints that are related to ramping and related to regulation that are harder to recognize in the original capacity expansion model. So the production cost model is really be able to tell you with a much more high or much higher fidelity what is the least cost operation of the system, and whether a system that the capacity expansion model is suggesting is actually being able to meet all the technical constraints. And when it doesn't, then you iterate and go back to the capacity expansion model, add a constraint, and then keep running until you achieve both. Next slide. And reliability models, very broadly, we'll see that reliability has many components here to the right. Namely, there is transmission and distribution reliability, there is what we call stability, there's operational reliability, and there's this emerging concept of resilience. But there's a well-established element of reliability that's called resource adequacy, where resource adequacy is defined by NERC as the ability of the power system to meet load at every hour using supply and demand side resources. So what a resource adequacy model does is that it's going back to our early discussion about Monte Carlo, is that in a best practice implementation uses a Monte Carlo approach to simulate thousands of versions of dispatching the power system. It's not a capacity expansion model. It's closer to a production cost model, but it doesn't quite do the dispatch, although it's going in that direction. Right now, it's mostly showing what resources are available at any given time, given underlying patterns of weather and potential outage rates that may be triggered to these resources on a random or non-random way. And it's letting us know on a certain system how much resources are available on any given hour to meet load that it's also potentially weather sensitive and can also have a sense of randomness to it. And so it shows the possible worst case scenarios. And you can see here in the next slide how that plays out. So when you run a reliability model, what you're looking here is, you have the right hand, the curve. You're seeing now that we're thinking in terms of probability distribution. So rather than having a single value of generation, we have a probability distribution for that generation, a range of values that it can take, given underlying weather conditions, underlying outage rates, and other, fuel availability and other aspects. And so what we're looking for exactly is that point that is sort of highlighted here in the curve, where load, the upper, sort of the top part of the tail, the right-hand side of the tail in the load curve goes over the lower hand of the tail, the lower side of the tail on the generation side, the supply side or the resources, meaning that that's a point where there's a risk of shortfall, where is a random hour where the load might be just higher than the available resources. And so these models record all across thousands of iterations what are each of the instances where something like this happens across a year. It records the number of times in that simulation, which is usually an annual hourly simulation, and it records the size of that load not being met and when it happened. And with that, you can track, whether the system is meeting a minimum amount of shortfalls or a minimum amount of frequencies that fall within some constraints, some target, for example, the well-known 1 day in 10-year standard. Now, some best practices for running resource adequacy models. First is to link this model with the portfolio creation in an iterative way, as I mentioned earlier, sort of starting to look away from the peak demand forecast as a single value, and then look at the resource adequacy model to really tell us how much capacity do we need to ensure that the system meets the reliability levels that we need. And that should be the source of capacity more than just a forecast of peak demand that is quite weather or non-responsive and non-stochastic. As Devi was just mentioning, these simulations are the ones that underlie the calculations of ELCCs, and so it's important that if we use these simulations, we can derive ELCCs for all the resources using a common framework. It's very important. And then it's also important to make the resource adequacy model sort of spatially explicit as much as possible. So making sure the model runs at a regional level, it's modeling transmission, and is recognizing the exchanges that occur with neighbors, also modeled through a stochastic way. But this requires, a larger amount of resources, but it reflects in a much higher fidelity the reality of the reliability operation of the system. Next slide. So just going back to our general model, modeling interconnection framework, we're gonna lay out a few best practices to connect these models together and operate them in an efficient way. So one is to ensure that the capacity expansion and production cost models are state of the art. Typically, the well-known developers of these models ensure that this happens, but there are, especially in our report, we outline certain criteria that these models have to comply with to be considered state-of-the-art models. There is a call for using open source model that has pros and cons, but one of the key benefits is that it enables a little bit more broader participation of other stakeholders in the modeling process when the model is open source. It has a number of trade-offs that are discussed in the report as well. It's important that the models, the selection of spatial and temporal scales is thoughtful. We expand on this in the report as well, but you have to think that these models can be calibrated with specific types of temporal granularity, with a certain type of planning horizon, with certain types of spatial resolution. And choosing the combinations of these is important to get the right answers. It's critical also to calibrate before you run capacity expansion and production cost models, try to ensure, especially the production cost model, that is calibrated such that the reflects the present day in a reasonable way. It's a little bit tricky to calibrate a capacity expansion model, but some of the technical calibrations that we get from the production cost model can be incorporated in the capacity expansion model, at least for existing resources. Finally, we want to let the optimization models optimize. So a practice that we don't like, that it's sometimes done, is when you force certain building decisions or you force certain retirement decisions. The truth is that the models are perfectly able to model retirements as part of the decision variables, and we suggest that that's the way they take, unless they're testing specific scenarios where you do want to potentially force a retirement in certain years and see what the impact is. Finally, using the models iteratively. We discussed already how the production cost model and the capacity expansion model run iteratively, and we are also outlining how we see just emerging the use of resource adequacy assessment models and capacity expansion models running iteratively as well. And that's something that will start happening more often. So we're going to move to the next slide, and I'll have another poll question. What shortcomings do you see in current planning models or modeling approaches? And this can be focus on the three models that we just discussed, the production cost, capacity expansion, and reliability models. It can be on other models that you're familiar with used in planning or operations. And what are shortcomings that you see? And as before, feel free to throw in ideas, with pressing the N to create a sticky note.
I don't see anyone throwing up any. Oh, there's a few popping up. Great.
Yeah, I was gonna say I saw a lot of mouse pointers moving around, but no specific notes. Let's give 30 seconds, and then I'll read some of those. All right, I'll start. This one's been written. I think it just finished. I'll just briefly refer to the couple notes that showed up. This was a more targeted question, so there's maybe less people familiar with models enough to answer it. But there's one really interesting one saying optimizing generation and transmission. That has been a sort of an aspirational gold standard for a while. It's now been achieved by several models and IRPs that have been doing explicitly representing transmission capacity expansion in the models, and then co-optimizing both at the same time and treating transmission as a capacity resource. But in general, it remains a shortcoming that is well laid out there. Uncertainty in how future policy might impact model results. That's true. I think what's underlying in that comment is potentially that most of these models remain non-stochastic. Planning remains a deterministic exercise. We deal with this uncertainty through scenarios, but there are emerging academic models that are called, that do robust decision making, where the decisions are robust to the variations that can underlie different parameters in the model. Perhaps one potential mid-ground solution that's being already seen in some IRPs is that some utilities take the results of the capacity expansion model and run it through a Monte Carlo approach in a production cost. And so they try to understand how much the system costs may deviate if the variable costs that are going to a model were to change. So for example, trying different versions of natural gas prices, coal prices, etc. So you get a sense of how much your cost is going to vary, and whether if it's too wide, then maybe your system is not super robust to potential deviations in your assumptions, and you can go back to a drawing board. With that, I think I'm going to give it back to Shelley so she can take it on a deeper explanation on exactly this scenario-based analysis.
Great. Thanks, JP. Let's see, the slides are making their way back up. Great. So I'll be talking a little bit more about scenario analysis. We use scenario analysis because we don't know exactly how the future is going to play out. So resource planners often need to model a variety of potential futures. So if we go to the next slide, Devi introduced the concept of scenarios in her earlier section of the presentation. So to reiterate, scenarios generally represent a change to multiple major assumptions that together represent a specific type of world or future that looks different than our present day assumptions. So an example of some scenarios that TVA modeled in its 2019 IRP are shown here. They put these together with help from an IRP working group and came up with these 6. So they modeled a base case, also what they called a current outlook. They modeled 2 different types of scenarios with different economic growth assumptions, one with a low economic growth and another with a high economic growth. They modeled a scenario with a more rapid decarbonization pathway, and then included 2 scenarios that adjusted the input assumptions for 2 specific technology types. One being for distributed energy resources, and then the last one being for nuclear plants. We go to the next slide. So scenarios are distinct from sensitivities in that sensitivities focus on changing a single key input to understand how that particular assumption drives results. And these sensitivities are often layered across multiple scenarios to see how they all react. So in the case of the TVA 2019 IRP again, they developed 10 different sensitivities that they layered on to the current outlook and a couple other scenarios. Things that they tested using the sensitivity analysis include higher and lower gas prices, changes to resource costs, demand side assumptions, the timing of renewable additions, the cost assumptions for legacy plants, the carbon constraints, as well as a variation in climate. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I typically think of scenario analysis and sensitivity analysis slightly differently. In a scenario analysis, the utility will often use a capacity expansion model, which JP introduced, to fully reoptimize the resource mix and produce a specific portfolio of resources that is best suited and least cost to that particular future. In a sensitivity analysis, resource planners may opt to use that same approach of using a capacity expansion model to develop a new set of resources catered to that particular sensitivity, or they may choose to fix or essentially lock in the resource build that was selected when they initially ran the scenario analysis, and then do more of a production cost run where they just see how the existing resources selected by the capacity expansion model in the step prior, how that responds. And this can help utilities evaluate the risk and cost of the original portfolio that was selected under changing circumstances. So if we were to use that high gas price sensitivity that TVA identified as an example, if they allowed the capacity expansion model to reoptimize after adjusting that input assumption, we may see the model selecting fewer new gas plants and opting for other resource types instead to meet energy needs. Versus if they do the second option, we would see the magnitude of cost differences that would result from having the original gas plants that the portfolio might have built being forced to dispatch in a higher gas price future. So both can be valuable for different reasons. Can we go to the next slide? Great. So our report identifies a number of different best practices that planners can keep in mind when they are going through the scenario design and sensitivity design step. And these best practices came up as a result of common challenges that planners often face during this step of the process. This includes the desire to want to model a comprehensive range of uncertainties with many scenarios to dig into different issues that might be interesting to stakeholders, and balancing that against wanting to produce a straightforward set of results, not have an IRP document that's 500 pages long with 30 plus scenarios where you can't really digest it all fully, and wanting to have results in a reasonable time frame as well. There's often also a balancing act that planners need to do between balancing stakeholder requests for specific scenarios that might be really important to them with the priorities of the utility, and as well as any state commission requirements. There's also a tension that can sometimes occur where there's slight differences in priorities between stakeholders, minimizing their risk and also being able to minimize ratepayer costs that don't always align. So some of the best practices that we include in the report to help with this narrowing down of the scenarios is to always include a robust base case that's designed to reflect a realistic view of the present day and abide by all existing federal, state, and regulatory requirements. And this kind of ties back to what Debbie was saying about how we want to make sure that the portfolios that are included in an IRP are legal and actually can make sure that they can comply with existing regulations. And then the next best practice is for utilities to include more of a fully optimized scenario in their IRP. So similar to what JP was saying when he was introducing the models, they're really good at developing least cost pathways, and they can do an even better job of that with more limited constraints. So a fully optimized scenario would have few or no constraints on things like annual build limits for new resources and timing of retirements for existing resources, so that we can see what the model would do in an unconstrained world. Third, we suggest that utilities design their scenarios to evaluate uncertainty and risk across a range of futures, which is easier said than done, especially because of the regulatory uncertainty. So one of the best practices that we provide for addressing regulatory uncertainty is for planners to model final rules, proposed rules, and also any likely regulations just to be most proactive in when it comes to planning. This way, even if the regulations change, there's a higher likelihood that you've modeled a scenario that's similar to the path that is kind of most likely to become the future, and it can essentially help the utility identify as early as possible what some near-term no regrets actions are, regardless of how some regulations might play out. If we could go to the next slide. This is just another utility example for Tucson Electric Power. This is its 2023 IRP kind of portfolio matrix. They use the term portfolio kind of interchangeably as scenario. So here they've identified 10 different scenarios that were of interest to their particular service territory. This ranges from changing the retirement date assumptions of some existing coal plants, as well as cost and adoption input assumptions related to new resources, including solar, storage, wind, pumped hydro, and small modular reactors. And then the utility here layered on a couple different types of sensitivities to certain portfolios. So they identified that they wanted to run sensitivity tests related to market prices, capital costs, and load growth. So if we go to the next slide, we have another poll question for you all. So this one, we'd like you to give an example of a scenario that would be helpful to model in your jurisdiction. So I'll give folks a minute or two to put their ideas here. It looks like so far we've got a couple similar ones, which is pretty interesting and definitely drives JP's point that load forecasting is a hot topic right now. And then the one on the far right, I can't, let's see, I can't read the full thing. There we go, one branch condition. All right. See, a couple people still writing, and I think we have time, so give folks another minute to write in.
This is our last poll question of the day, so don't miss your opportunity. Put
Yeah,
a
thanks,
sticky
guys.
note on there. It's very satisfying.
Great. Yeah, so in addition to load growth, I see yeah, some people's jurisdictions are interested in fossil plant retirement dates. That's definitely one that I've seen commonly tested amongst utility IRPs. Transmission hardening, that's one that I haven't personally reviewed an IRP of. I don't think that's covered that, but that sounds like it could be a really interesting scenario to include if you're in a particularly maybe vulnerable or transmission constrained area. Pathways to meet clean energy standards, definitely a big one that I've seen as well, especially among states where they're potentially ramping up some of their RPS policies. And emergency conditions, I imagine that could be sort of like I think one of the participants earlier said, there are weather conditions in certain areas that might be interesting to do scenario analysis on. So thanks for answering the poll, and we can continue to move on. So, as you might guess, after completing the modeling analysis, the next step would be to report the results so that stakeholders and other like regulators can see what the differences are amongst all the scenarios. So in our report, we highlight a couple of different key outputs that we recommend all utility IRPs include in their report. This includes important things like load or peak demand forecasts by year, the resource capacities by year and type, the generation mix and capacity factors also by resource type, including data on emissions, including CO2 and other criteria pollutants, as well as clearly calling out any plant retirement dates by the specific years that they're occurring. And last but not least, the portfolio cost. So on the right, we have a screenshot of the Tucson Electric Power's portfolio dashboard. I think they do a pretty good job at displaying a lot of the key information that we put as best practice in the report. So on the upper right, they have included information on the capacity contribution of each resource type in megawatts for each year of the planning period. We also have two different graphs showing the generation mix by resource type on an absolute basis to kind of show the load growth over time, as well as on a kind of levelized percentage basis. You can see the share contributions over time. They've also called out resource additions and retirements for each year. And this is helpful for stakeholders to see at a glance how much is getting added and retired from the system in each year of the analysis. And then they've also included emissions reductions trajectories for CO2 and NOx, as well as a water use reduction graph. Next slide, please. Okay. So the next step after presenting the results is to use those to value and compare plans. And so essentially the utilities and stakeholders will need to look critically and see how each portfolio stacks up against a set of key metrics. Some metrics that we've seen in our work that are often considered during this plan evaluation step include cost. This is generally presented as a net present value of revenue requirement metric, and that can be sliced to just look at a short-term NPVRR, or it can be for the full study period. We'll see environmental cost or impact metrics, reliability metrics, fuel diversity, how it will impact customer rates and bills, as well as if there are any major changes to local economy or jobs. A couple best practices that I wanted to highlight from the report here when it comes to evaluating IRP results against metrics is for the utility to do this at the outset of the IRB process in collaboration with stakeholders and regulators. So it's important for that to kind of happen at the beginning so that we're on the same page and we can make sure that the selected metrics are aligned with region-specific needs and goals, and it can kind of prevent any skewing of the rankings at the end of the process. So those are things to keep in mind. And if we go to the next slide, can see how TEP presented their kind of portfolio ranking. So this part of the process often involves creating a scorecard or a matrix. So in the case of TEP, the utility presents metrics for NPV across fuel, or they have total NPV, they have the fuel specific and non-fuel NPV broken out. They've presented kind of just the factual cumulative additions for context, and then have highlighted 3 different environmental results: CO2 reductions, NOx reductions, as well as water reductions. And so I thought this was interesting because because Tucson Electric Power is in Arizona, it makes sense that they would highlight water reduction as kind of a key metric for stakeholders to see how it compares across portfolios, whereas another utility in a different jurisdiction might have different concerns and would not necessarily pick the same ones. So this can be kind of an interesting jurisdiction-specific process. Next slide, please. Okay. So after creating that scorecard and matrix, the goal is to select a preferred portfolio. This process of selecting a preferred portfolio requires kind of doing a balance of cost and risk. This is because there's not usually one scenario that rises to the top as being like least cost and most reliable with the lowest emissions, while also having the best impact on the economy. There's usually, some metrics where it does better and worse. So while minimizing cost or having the lowest NPV/RR can be really important, it might be a key metric, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that that's going to be the preferred portfolio. Some best practices for utilities when they're selecting a preferred portfolio is for them to clearly justify any reasons for selecting a preferred portfolio that is not, the optimized portfolio. And to avoid developing a preferred portfolio outside of the model, since that often results in kind of a mishmash or cherry-picked portfolio that's not subject to the same level of, sensitivity analysis and risk analysis as one of the main portfolios that was selected from the scenario analysis. And I think the next slide is my last slide here. So the reason why we want utilities to select a preferred portfolio is because it guides near-term actions, particularly procurement. So if the utility does not select or identify a preferred portfolio, it can be harder for stakeholders and regulators to give the utility feedback and harder for them to oversee, how the future decisions overlap with, modeling results. One important caveat here is that the utility's preferred portfolio doesn't necessarily lock them in or tie them to doing everything exactly as the model selected. It's meant to be a guide, and especially if conditions change, usually it's reasonable to not necessarily follow the preferred portfolio to a T, and just kind of use it to inform future proceedings. So with that, I will pause and tie it back into the next section on integration of IRP with other proceedings.
Thanks, Shelley. We do have time for a couple questions. We have a few minutes. If anyone would like to raise their hands and then come off of mute and ask a question, we can give it a minute. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. Anyone, feel free to, again, put your questions in the chat. Otherwise, we can move along to the next section. Thank you, Shelley.
Then I think I'll pass it to Debbie.
Great, thanks, Shelley. So the last two sections, we're going to discuss the integration of IRP with other proceedings, and then JP is going to finish it up with the short-term action plan. So next slide. So one of the things that we don't go into this in depth in this best practices report, but one of the things we've observed over the years is the way that the IRP process kind of silos the resource planning exercise from many of the other proceedings that are directly related to, that might be inputs into the IRP that might have large impacts. And so we wanted to briefly just talk about the IRP and how it relates to other proceedings to really put the IRP in context. So just, I mean, as an example, actually, I filed testimony today in a RPS, or Renewable Energy Standard docket in Michigan. And a big part of that RPS was looking at the compliance plan of the utilities from the utilities' most recent IRP. So even though the compliance plan was not developed in the RPS docket, it was developed in the IRP. That was that IRP portfolio was the basis of the utility's analysis for its RPS compliance plan for the utility to figure out, is it in compliance with the RPS based on its plan from the IRP. So that's just one example. Other utility proceedings, procurement, so request for proposals. So the outcome of the IRP, so the preferred portfolio, generally there's a near-term need for procurement. Utilities generally, if they're building something, if they're looking for a PPA, there's usually going to be requests for proposals, RFPs, that will either come out of the IRP or be used, in fact, to inform, as we talked about, the resource cost assumptions. So really integrating the process. So, a best practice is doing the RFPs beforehand so that you know what resource costs are, what resources are available. But alternatively, if you're doing the RFPs after, really just making sure that the need is still there from the IRP, that the prices, that the costs are up to date, that the costs from the RFPs are aligned with the costs that were modeled in the IRP. If there's a massive deviation, making sure that it's still the least cost option. There was a discussion, I discussed earlier, the importance of understanding the temporal limitations on bringing resources online and reflecting those. So a utility might issue an RFP and only think it needs 50 megawatts of new resources, but maybe it gets really good bids for 200, and it realizes that it's having issues with procurement. So maybe integrating that into, instead of just saying, oh, our RFP only said we need 50, well, looking at the bid saying, oh, actually, we're having trouble bringing resources online. Maybe we should bring online more than just the 50 we were looking for. So understanding how those processes link together. Transmission planning. So transmission planning is not directly part of the IRP process, but it is generally an input. And it is a process that can be done in tandem, that can be done sometimes by the regional transmission operators, by the RTO beforehand. Incorporating transmission planning, or at least understanding how it relates, is important because transmission can be an alternative or a supplement to building new generation. So understanding the role that transmission can play in lowering costs, in connecting the utility to the market, to other places where there might be lower cost resources. So I do a lot of work in Arizona and New Mexico. So there is a lot of high quality wind in part of the state of New Mexico. And the big challenge is connecting transmission to get there. If the utilities just look at their footprint and what is available, that's not going to be incorporated into their modeling. They're not going to, include the cost of connecting to that wind. However, if they look further out, incorporate this transmission planning, they'll say, oh, okay, if we know the cost to connect to that high quality wind on the, eastern side of the state, we know we need to build transmission to reach it. If we add that into our modeling as a resource assumption, that might be a lower cost solution. That's not something that you will inherently incorporate into an IRP if you're not also looking at the transmission planning components. Rate cases and rate and bill impacts. So JP talked a bit about high load earlier and large load from data centers and that new trend. One of the big concerns, the big issues that keeps coming up in IRPs and in rate cases is how to both plan for that new load, but also understand the cost impacts. So in IRPs, the utilities don't generally look at cost allocation and ratepayer class impacts. They look at total revenue requirement. But it's really important to understand the rate impact. So if a data center is trying to decide where to locate, they're doing that partially based on the rates that they are going to have to pay, on their cost for electricity. There's no way the utility can actually accurately tell the data center how much their electricity is going to cost unless they've done that analysis. And if they're not doing that analysis as part of their IRP, but they're modeling this new data center load, it's like, there's a disconnect, right? So there's no way they can actually accurately communicate to the new data centers what the cost to serve them is if they're not doing that analysis and they're just assuming they're going to be serving the data centers. Energy justice proceedings. So in some states, energy justice proceedings are actually being held separate from individual, IRP or rate case proceedings. So to really understand the impact of resource planning, of rate cases, of other proceedings on energy justice. I personally think a best practice is to integrate energy justice into all proceedings instead of having it standalone, but I certainly understand that some states are approaching it differently and doing standalone. Another topic with a lot of overlap is natural gas planning. So the natural gas system is supplies gas for both heating and for electric supply. And so there needs to be integration of how those two systems overlap. So there are natural gas utilities do their own IRPs, but there's a lot of overlap with the planning that goes on from natural gas planners and for electric resource planners. And there's not generally a lot of coordination between those two, unless you have a company that happens to own assets or own utilities in both fields. So that's all I have for this one. JP, I think I'll throw it to you for the short-term action plan.
Yeah, thanks, Devi. I'm going to wrap it up with the some brief commentary on the action plan, which is actually coincidentally so probably typically the last portion of the IRP document itself. So the action plan comes from the fact that IRPs are just massive efforts. As you have seen, only in these 3 hours, we have covered an immense amount of material that applies to the entirety of the power system, at least the bulk power system for the most part. And typically there are dozens of documents, not even talking about testimony, and thousands of results and pages. So the action plan is a requirement that most IRP mandates have for the utility to outline very clearly what are the near-term procurement decisions, including some business development needs and analytical needs that they should do over the next 1 to 4 years. And many elements of the action plan are included in the statutes, so the utilities have to comply with them. But we still believe that a well-developed action plan should include some of the following elements. First is identifying the assets specifically and individually to be procured, or at the very least identify specific components of the preferred portfolio coming from the IRP that are going to be put for requests for proposals or that have been confirmed through a series of IRPs that are now due for procurement. And so including and describing clearly what are the capacity for these assets, the location, the timing. And there is still a potential gap that will occur as the CPCN request goes through the certificate of public need where there may be some minor changes, but at the very least, the utility is sort of prompted to identify specific procurement needs. It's important to understand some good action plans outline outstanding analytical drawbacks or shortcomings from the current work. So, as you run the IRP, you realize that certain conditions, certain scenarios, certain types of analysis did not quite provide the level of rigor or depth that was needed, and in part because there wasn't maybe the first time that it was being done. And so that is something that occurs with IRP, because IRPs evolve as they get developed. And so you're never doing a cookie cutter version of the previous IRP. There's always new stuff that comes up, new challenges, especially in these very fast evolving times. And so part of the action plan should outline what are those impending analytical needs and how the utility plans to work around them. And finally, there are some strategies that the utility should outline to comply with near-term regulatory mandates. So many states, for example, for RPS targets. And so the utility should outline how it's planning to meet its RPS, what is their aspirations to meet, and how the current procurement and near-term procurement might help meet some of those targets, or what are strategies to meet multiple targets down the road, again, especially in the near term. So with that, I think that's the last slide of our training. And as you see here, this is our contact information. Please feel free to take a snapshot of this slide or just to jot down our emails. We're always welcome any type of reaching out. I already had one person from this training reach out as the training was undergoing, and I have an email here waiting with very interesting questions that I'm planning to tackle later. So feel free to reach to any of us or the three of us with any questions that you have related to the planning process or more generally the power system as it's evolving. Thanks so much, and back to you, Miles.
Thank you, JP, Devi, Shelley, so much. One of the side benefits of moderating these trainings is that I get to sit and listen in and learn. So we do have a couple minutes. If there's anyone with last opportunity to raise your hand here and ask any questions from any of the trainers. We do have a question from Caroline Rezer. How would you respond to a utility spokesperson who says in response to criticism that the IRP is more of a compass than a roadmap, telling reporters it's meant to give us a general direction, not to be specific about whether it's gas versus coal versus nuclear versus renewable energy, all of which, by the way, we're going to have in the mix for quite some time. So really what the IRP is intended to do is to give us a general direction. Is this defensible? Does it just depend on the state requirements for IRPs? This is in the chat. If anyone would like to, JP, Devi, Shelley, you guys would like to try and answer this one?
I'm happy to take a stab at it. So that sounds like something I've heard in TVA's IRP recently, Tennessee Valley Authority, using that language of a compass, not a roadmap. I understand that, committing to something that 15 years in the future doesn't really make sense, right? But I don't, as JP was talking about, it's important to have an accurate short-term action plan, right? Like if you're not using your IRP to try to accurately understand the near term, what's happening in the next 5 to 10 years, then it's kind of a waste of ratepayer money of dollars. So I certainly don't expect utilities to commit to things that are coming up in the IRP results in 20 years, but they absolutely should be using it for near-term procurement, for near-term planning, for understanding what are the no regrets resource options that show up across all portfolios, kind of regardless of actions. And if a utility is saying otherwise, then they're really just wasting time.
Thanks, Devi. Anyone else? Could put it in the chat or raise your hand. Great. Okay. Well, on that note, thanks again to the three of you. And thanks to our fellows who appreciate your time here. We're looking forward to seeing you in the next training. Again, I've posted the links to where the slides are, and when the recording has been processed, we will put the recording on there as well. Everyone, please have a safe and fun Halloween, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.